Hi everyone, and welcome to our last video lecture of the semester. So we've thought about the Glasstown game as children's literature last week. I'd like to continue our consideration of genre in my lecture today by thinking about two different things. First of all, the way in which the Glasstown game is framed as historical fiction or biography, and secondly, the way in which the Glasstown game may or may not fit into a tradition with other children's literature. To start with the historical fiction question, in criticism, historical fiction is seen as doing a few different things. Firstly, historical fiction is historical interpretation. So Harry Shaw, in The Forms of Historical Fiction, suggests when we experience the work of literature, we employ in a refined and complex way our general ability to see the world in terms of significant groups and patterns. So, in other words, historical fiction reworks historical periods and events into patterns of interpretation that suggest to the reader which people, events, and trends mattered, and also suggests to the reader a mode of interpreting these people, events, and trends. I think this is especially important with a work like Glasstown Game, especially in the ways that deals with things like gender or religion. So in historical fiction, Shaw would argue the simple act of deciding what story to tell and how to tell it is an act of interpretation. Another thing that historical fiction allows us to do is to take abstract historical ideas and connect them to the human experience. George Lukács, another writer on historical fiction, is quoted as saying, "Throughout the plot of the historical novel, at whose center stands the typical hero, a neutral ground is sought and found upon which the extreme opposing social forces can be brought into a human relation with one another." So in children's literature especially, historical fiction can allow an author to help make abstract ideas like Victorian gender or technology come alive for children by placing them into stories that help the ideas feel more human. While much of the Glasstown game takes place in a fantastical world, it is very much framed, I think, as historical fiction. Not only are the early chapters a biography of the young Bronte's lives, but issues of young girls' education, gender roles, gender relationships, religion, even international relationships, if you look at the presence of Napoleon and the various attitudes towards the French that are communicated, all of these issues are deeply woven into even the most fantastical elements of the story. What I'd like us to do in part this week is consider how the Glasstown Games uses its historical setting to explore issues from the past in a way that helps young readers connect to the ideas. Another thing I'd like to ask is whether or not the Glasstown Game fits into any tradition of children's literature of which you might be aware. As I read the novel for the first time, I immediately thought of Alice in Wonderland and also of the Phantom Toll Booth, two stories which have often been compared in the past and which I found out later by the simple act of turning over my copy of the book and reading the back of it. They're both stories which have been compared with the Glasstown Game. As I'm currently reading the book now, I've been thinking about what the novel does to contribute to children's literature as a collection, as a genre. And I've been asking myself, what does this do similarly to other books, and what does it seem to do that's different? And maybe also what's the value of what it does differently? What does it contribute to children readers? We talked about the value of reading children's literature as children and as adults, and I'm curious, how do we see that specifically in the Glasstown Game? How is this a valuable book? So the question of the week is going to be asking you a question very similar to that. It's going to be asking you to consider the Glasstown Game in relationship to other children's stories with which you're familiar, and evaluating the value of the Glasstown Game as a book for both children and adults. Thank you, and as always, remember to connect with me via email or via Zoom office hours if you have any questions, especially about the final project. Have a good week, everybody. Bye.